done? How's lunch? How are the lines for lunch? Okay. Uh, we're going to talk all about dark theme, the fundamentals, the how, the what, the why, and more importantly, what to keep in mind when implementing dark theme. This talk is intended typically for apps that are built with light themes and are making the transition to light theme, to dark themes, or for apps that are halfway there and have done half the theming, getting there, and this talk will also highlight what to keep in mind when doing that transition. Yeah. Quick introduction about me. I'm Faiz. I lead design at a small company called Agraya Tech in India. I used to be Google expert for design. I now mentor Google's Launchpad program also for design. And I run the Google Developer Group in Mumbai. Uh, I kind of found this title for my talk really apt. Not only does it happen to be from one of my favorite movies, but it sort of signifies the struggle that comes with implementing dark themes on Android, where just making the switch to a dark background color and light text isn't really everything that there is to it. There are a lot of nuances, there are a lot of pitfalls, there are a lot of things that can go wrong in the end user experience, and just taking the color hex codes that you get from your designer or flipping the theme in the styles XML file isn't really all the dark theming should be. Dark theming should involve diving into how and why things are done, why certain decisions are taken the way they are, and how that evolves into uh, justifying the decisions that you take when switching to this dark theme. Understanding why these decisions are made simplifies the entire journey and helps you understand why certain things are done. So somewhere down the line, where either way you're building your app independent of a designer, or your designer gives you certain guidelines to follow, or you are a designer doing dark theming, uh, you know why things are happening the way they are. Uh, the theoretical definition of a dark theme is that it is an alternate mode of UI, a supplement to a default light theme on Android. As a fervent fan of dark theming, I don't agree. Why do we have to be second-class citizens? If you want to go dark theme first, go for it. Just as long as it suits your brand identity, that's all you should keep in mind. So, dark theme isn't really a secondary or default theme. It's just an alternative that you have available to you. Whether you want to go light, whether you want to go dark, it's completely up to you and your product managers. Four important fundamentals that make up the complete dark theming experience. We're going to dive into each one of them to a very detailed level and sort of split up how implementation looks for design teams as well as for developer teams working independently of design teams. The first and most important aspect of dark theming is about elevation. Elevation plays a key role in material design. Uh, to signify context, hierarchy, and the distancing of elements from the viewer. Uh, in material design, there are 10 different levels of elevation, starting from 0 dp right up to 24 dp. Uh, there are the 10 levels, 24 numbers, the steps are not even, but this is what the Android the guidelines recommend. When you're doing elevations on dark design, the level of elevation that you do on light theming, as well as the settings for drop shadows that come with the elevations, they remain the same. What changes? So the way elevation on material design works, the way the material design world exists, is with a metaphorical world that exists in your device, where your screen is the light source and there are surfaces below it. As surfaces are elevated within your app, as they come closer to the screen, the metaphorical light source, the shadow radius and blur tends to increase. And as the color on that surface comes closer to light, it becomes a lighter color. Uh, seeing as material is built on a lot of real-world examples, if you take something that is black closer to white light, it tends to become grayish, and material design follows exactly that principle. So two things to keep in mind: shadow and radius and blur increases, and surface color changes. Now, if you were to do that on dark UI, and if you notice that both those cards have different levels of shadow, but because your background is dark, it doesn't really make a difference. Keeping the same, just using shadows to signify the elevation that what we do in light theming. That doesn't really work in dark design because you can't see the shadows. The user cannot extract that information that the shadows convey, that certain surfaces are more elevated than other surfaces, and the meaning of the shadows are completely lost. Now, some people like to follow the option of doing colored shadows, but it's very anti-material. Uh, there were some experimentations around reflective surfaces, but it's not really recommended because it's not indicative of the real world the material design is built upon. Since we can't use shadows to convey the elevation, the other important thing is the color of the surface. The default color in dark design is a hex code 121212. And as surfaces increase in elevation and come closer to the screen, they're, they get lightened up and they become closer to white. And at the maximum elevation, that is 24 dp, it becomes like a lightish gray that you see at the bottom. In between, there are multiple steps for all the different levels of elevation. And these multiple steps are used to convey the different levels. Like, for example, there's the toolbar, which is at 8 dp, and the floating action button, which is above it. So takeaway is white overlay on your surfaces is the key difference between light and dark design when you're doing elevation in dark design. Handoff is a super important stage where sometimes design and development tends to conflict, and more often than people like, design tends to lose the perfection that it had. Because in the real world, I mean, design is a lot of things are done in an imaginative world where all motion can be accomplished, all designs are very easy to do, but on a real world as a developer, it's a little more difficult than that. So if you're a designer and you're handing off dark designs to a developer, don't give the surface colors for different levels of elevation and ask them to set the view background to those colors. That's not how dark theming should be done. The system handles dark color elevation by default for you. So if you're a designer handing off designs, specify the type of component used and the elevation for the component. If you're a developer, get the elevation and just set the Android elevation attribute. I hope you're fortunate enough to have a main API of Lollipop. If you are, then you just set the Android elevation attribute and let the system handle it for you. The Android framework will lighten your surfaces based on the elevation attribute you set for them. Don't get into custom color setting unless you're doing branded dark design, which we'll dive into a little bit later. Right. So on the left, if you're a designer, you follow those alpha attributes. They're available on the Android material design guidelines. And if you're a developer, you just set the Android elevation attribute, which uses the color on surface attribute that is buried in the material design. Doesn't really apply, but it's something you want to dive into how it works. That's the attribute you go with, color on surface. Some apps, and most notably Twitter, does dark design in a slightly different way, where you choose to not follow the default dark color that's given, which is the 1212 hex code, and instead use a slightly brand tinted dark mode to reinforce the brand identity that the app carries. So if you look at use Twitter in dark mode, it uses like a dark blue surface and not a traditional dark gray surface. If that's something you want to do, of course there's ways to do it, and there's a particular way to do it. In this context, if you're a designer handing off to a developer, you definitely have to give hex codes. How do you get those hex codes? Well, as a designer, you set an 8% opacity overlay on the hex code that Android has given you. So assuming you have a brand color that's completely red, and you take the default view for that Android's dark color, which is 1.2, and you overlay your brand color on top of that and set an 8% opacity to it. So if you look at this example, I've done it with a pink layer, and with the 8% opacity, I get a completely new hex code, which is now my default surface for dark designing on Android. Again, this is the color I set to the surfaces, and then I let the elevation attribute handle the rest of the lightning. Accessibility has to be kept in mind, a super important factor for dark designing. All contrast ratios should be checked using the WCAG accessibility guidelines. We'll touch on that in a little bit. An example of elevation on dark design and how it works. So if you look at the background, which is super dark, there are cards above it which are a little bit lighter. And there's a toolbar at the bottom which is even lighter than the cards. So this is like a manifestation of everything we just spoke about, where the lightening of the views tells about their level in the Z index. The toolbar is at the highest level and thus is lighter than either the cards or the background. The next fundamental for dark designing is color. So there are two aspects to how color is handled in dark designs. One is desaturated color and the second is limited color. Color is a super important factor in any modern digital product, like whether it's an app, whether it's a website, and handling color correctly when switching to a dark theme is essential to whether a dark theme looks good or whether it just looks garish. Flipping the background to a dark color and assuming your same brand colors will work is it's a very common thing that most people tend to do. And while this is extensively been covered in the material guidelines, there is an entire reasoning behind how and why to carry that out. So this is an example of an app that I worked upon. And what I did was I just switched the background color to the one that Android gives you and put all the text and in white. If you look at the didn't get it resend code text, it's barely visible. If you look at the arrow in the corner, it's barely visible. And while the fab is visible, it looks a little garish because I've used the same color that I use in light design but switched the background to black. So as a result, the contrast is a little harsh. Some of the text isn't readable, and overall, it ends up looking like a really poor implementation of dark theming. The way color has to be handled in dark UI is that the problem with color, using color, the same colors that you use in light design, is that the saturation levels are too high for those colors. Using the same colors in dark design results in a very harsh look to the app, and more often than not, it doesn't meet any contrast or accessibility guidelines. As a result, it simply doesn't work. The way to go about fixing this is desaturating the primary and accent colors. If you're a designer, you need to desaturate the color palette that you use down to a tonal value of about 300 to 200. Those are the colors that typically tend to work best. If you see something that it doesn't really fit for you, if you play around, just make sure you're keeping the accessibility guidelines in mind and your color works with the dark background. If you're a developer, it becomes a little more complicated because you definitely need a design tool to calculate the background color and the color overlay to it. Not something that you want to do. Like if you're struggling enough with Android Studio as it is, and then if you involve design tools in the mix, things get a little iffy. However, there's this link that I found. I was just looking around for a tool that does something like this, and this link that I found allows you to input a background color and an RGB color on top of that, and then set an opacity value, which in this case you're setting, for example, if you're using a branded surface, you set to 0.08, which is the 8% opacity that we needed. It gives you an RGB value to use as an output, and you can then use that for your branded surfaces. This was the slightly fixed version of the color on dark design that I worked with. The text is visible because the pink is desaturated. The fab pops a little less and looks less garish because the pink is desaturated. And the app navigation is actually visible for once. Coloring surfaces. So one of the primary reasons for implementing dark design is to enhance readability and visibility at night times, so that screens aren't really too bright and harsh. And the second effect is, of course, battery life. Having large colored surfaces on your app kind of defeats that purpose, because if you have like even something that's 1/3 of the screen in a brand color or a bright color, that's like 33% of your efforts kind of being meaningless because it's not achieving the output that the user wants or that the device needs. As a result, you need to avoid colored surfaces that are too large. Try to stick to smaller things like buttons, components, not entire cards or containers. Coloring elements is where you typically put your brand color. The only slight hitch that comes up with this is that when your surfaces and everything else in your app is a dark color, and your accent becomes your primary color, which leaves sometimes it leaves no place for your accent. However, with trial and error, you can fit it in there. There's no hard yes or no whether you should use three colors, that is a dark, a primary, and an accent. Most dark apps just use a dark color and a primary color as the accent. But then it's up to you. That's why Material Design 2 was like kind of throwing the doors open. Back in 14 when it launched, it was very restrictive. Material Design 2 lets you experiment a little as long as you're meeting the accessibility guidelines. Just go for it. Brand identity is something that always comes up, especially if you're dealing with product managers or any designers. Right? They don't want to lose the brand colors because it means everything to them. The app is built around a certain identity, and if you were to desaturate those colors, it wouldn't really be achieving the purpose that the app sets out to. However, there is a provision for this. Certain small elements of the UI can retain their brand color on the conditions that they're not too large and they don't detract away from the value of the rest of the screen. Like, for example, again, coming back to the screen, I've kept the logo in the original color and haven't desaturated it because it would harm the brand's image. But everything else, the other colors that are on the screen, you can go ahead and desaturate them. The material color palette is a very fantastic tool for achieving those desaturated colors if one of the above two solutions didn't work for you. There's a link that's in the next slide, but if you go to that and you just input any hex code that you're working with, it gives you an entire color palette to work with. If you're a designer, you can try to eyeball this and see what works for you. If you're not really familiar with how color theory works, then you ideally want to pick either 200 or 300 tonal values and use those as the accent colors in your dark design. Text coloring is again super important. A lot of us tend to, if there's less emphasis text, whether it's subtitles or body text, tend to use a lighter shade of black for it, either whether it's dark gray or light gray to show the differences. However, it shouldn't be done in light design, that's off the bat, but it shouldn't be carried over to dark design as well. The thing that you need to do is play around with opacity. That's the key to getting different levels of importance in text, right? High emphasis text uses an opacity of 87%. Why 87 is something I've been asked before. Why not 100%? I'm going to cover that towards the end. Medium emphasis text uses 60, and disabled text has an opacity of 38%. Don't go above or below these ratios. You can play around between them, but above it we'll talk about, and below it you won't meet contrast guidelines that people need to see your app with. Two perfect resources to work with when dealing with color and design in dark design. The first one is the material color tool, which is available on the material.io site, but it's buried under a maze of links. If you just go to this bit.ly link, you get directed to that page, and you can start playing around with the colors and configuring your palette. The second is even more important because accessiblecolors.com allows you to check whether the color standards you're using, whether it passes the accessibility standards or not. It asks you to input the background color you're working with and the foreground color you're working with, which in this case would be either your brand color or your text color. And it gives you a certification so there are two basic certifications for accessibility guidelines. One is the AA certification, one is the AAA certification. The AA is a little more lenient and the more stringent to getting high contrast ratios. Sorry, the AAA is a little more stringent to achieving contrast ratios, and the AA is a little more lenient. Ideally, you want to go for a AAA certification. So when you input your brand color and your background color on that website, you should get a AAA. Try to work towards that. If you're a little bit off, that's okay, but definitely stay above the AA certification. The third and perhaps the most important aspect of dark designing is contrast, because while the dark design may look cool and it may serve your users' purposes of saving battery and helping them read at night, it all completely defeats the purpose if contrast ratios aren't met, if content is getting lost in the background, or if the right things aren't called out. Why contrast? Because it helps certain things stand out and it's very important for accessibility. If you look at the image, the high contrast text easy to read, low contrast text difficult to read, pretty basic stuff, right? But how does this translate to dark design? Dark surfaces and white body text should have a contrast error of at least 15.8:1. The accessibility standards, if you look at the accessiblecolors.com, it typically says a ratio of 4.5:1. But when you're doing dark designing on Android, it should definitely be 15.8:1. Why? Let's dive into both those ratios. So the web content accessibility guidelines state that you require a 4.5:1 ratio between background and foreground. This accounts for all levels of accessibility and legibility, whether it's for surfaces or for text. However, Google says that you need to use this much more stringent ratio when dealing with dark design on Android. Uh, why is perfectly described here. If you look at the color on top, it's way over the 4.5 requirement. It's 13.7 is to 1, and it passes the AA certification and is just short of the AAA certification. However, when the Android system elevates that view to the lighter colors that we spoke about earlier, when you said like an elevation 24 dp to that view, that ratio is lost because Android tends to lighten the background. So when the background is lightened and your text isn't high enough, it against the light background, it tends to lose that perfect contrast ratio that it had. Aiming for the 15.8 is to 1 or going above that kind of helps you avoid that, because even on the lightest surfaces that Android does, your text is still perfectly readable and doesn't hamper the end user experience. Things to watch out for, a list of personal experiences that I've had while designing dark UI and that aren't very obviously available or aren't in the guidelines definitely. Using light fonts on dark surfaces tends to make them appear a little more heavy than the other way around. This is not something that you can measure or that has metrics, or even if your average user might not even tell you. But if you compare them side by side, it's completely a visual phenomenon where light text on dark backgrounds tends to appear a little heavy. It's something that you might not have to tweak or even have to think about, but it's something that you should definitely keep in mind because it might play a role in how importantly text is highlighted in certain parts of the UI. Long form reading. This was called out on Twitter some time back, and when Google News did dark design. When on a bigger screen or an LCD or an OLED screen, when the pixels light up to white and the long form text is being displayed on the screen, and more importantly, when the user is scrolling that text, the pixels need to rapidly change between white and black, and that causes a flicker and a bleed on the edges of the text. So if you're doing long form text, definitely don't go for a very dark background on light background. Try to reduce that ratio a little bit to a little lighter gray. Definitely don't go 1:2, 1:2, 1:2, or even worse, don't go full black, because it's going to cause eye fatigue. It's going to cause stress for the user while reading, and not provide the best user experience. Also, something that you might want to keep in mind is how other font factors like weight, line spacing, and family play out. So this is totally something you have to eyeball. It doesn't come with any chart to look at or checklist to work with. Just something you should think about. The emotional aspect of colors in dark design. If you look at the Google logo on a dark background, it doesn't feel like the friendly logo that we're all familiar with and the one that we love. This is because colors tend to stand out a little more on dark backgrounds, and since color is largely dependent on emotional theory, they tend to lose the meaning they might have had when originally picked. Again, this factors into why colors tend to be desaturated. You can't desaturate brand colors, but again, something to think about. Testing dark UI. While ideally field testing, user research testing is key to developing any successful products, when you're doing dark design, keep in mind that also has to be tested in the field and with real users, because your dark UI might look perfect under fluorescent lighting. It might not look perfect under lack of lighting or incandescent lighting, or it might look completely different. Illustrations are something that are often overlooked because they are like an ancillary part of the UI. Definitely think about your drawables folder as well. If you have any flat illustrations that you're working with, if you have any problems with flat illustrations that you're working with, was I not audible all this time? Yeah. Okay. Illustrations usually tend to be super colorful and stand out a lot. You don't want that happening too much on dark design. You want it to stand out but not be a little over the top, because again, what we spoke about having too much colorful surfaces on a dark screen isn't the result you want to end up with. When dealing with illustrations on dark design, desaturate the vibrant foreground colors that you're working with, darken the background colors so it stands out just enough, but not too much. Halation is something that is an effect that comes into play. It's not something that's often spoken about, but it draws its origins from photography and filmography. So if you look at the image, the light source is much smaller than the apparent light, also called light bleed, when light sources tend to bleed out into the surrounding areas and appear much larger than they originally should, typically blurry or not very pleasant to look at. This can also happen when you're dealing with text on dark backgrounds, somewhat similar to the long form reading aspect that we spoke about, but keep in mind that your contrast ratios aren't too high. If you look at the WCAG guidelines, completely white text on completely black backgrounds has a ratio of 24:1. You definitely don't want to go that high. Stay between the 15.8 to 22. That's like the sweet spot for contrasts. Going over will cause eye fatigue and halation. Black surfaces is something that is fervently debated in both the design and developer and end user spaces. Do you go dark gray or do you go full black? I would love to be proven wrong on this, but as per my reading and research, and I even have a source in there if you want to dispute that or follow up in my slides, dark gray themes consume that much more of battery compared to a black screen. There's an entire article that is like super interesting to read about how the pixels work and how they switch on and off. And if you're looking at how much you lose when you implement a fully black theme, the contrast, the elevation, the visuals, it's not really worth that much percentage of battery. So if you're looking to do a fully black theme, you might want to reconsider. You might want to consider this percentage, and you might want to also weigh it against everything that you lose. Okay, before I head to a conclusion, is there any questions I can help you with? Okay, doesn't seem to be, but I'm going to be around for the rest of the day at least. So if there's anything if you have an app that's done really well in dark design, or if there's something that you thought I could do better in terms of the guidelines, definitely reach out to me. If there's any advice you need, I'll be here to help. But wrapping up, the three things that you need to keep in mind are elevation, color, and contrast. In elevation, use lighter surfaces. Don't rely on shadows to convey the meaning that elevation brings in material design. When you're dealing with color, use dark surfaces. Don't use brightly colored or white surfaces anywhere in your app. Desaturate your primary and accent colors. Otherwise, they're going to look harsh and garish. Keep contrast in mind. It's perhaps the most important factor when dealing with dark design. Don't just stick to a 4.5 ratio. Try to aim for the 15.8 ratio to account for the complete modification of your colors that material design does. A couple of things, and users can now force dark themes on Android 10. If you don't keep all this in mind and don't account for all the situations, and for Android 10 forcing dark theme on your app will definitely break your design in some way or the other, in some godforsaken way that you probably didn't even consider. While these guidelines provide like a broad set of things that you should check off your list or pay attention to, each product is different and unique. So pay attention to those nuances that make your product stand out, that make your product different, and either talk to your design team or look online for resources on how to best provide the dark experience for your end users. Test thoroughly, test with variety, both in terms of lighting conditions, device screen quality, types of users. You might get insights that you perhaps didn't even consider. And don't leave anything out, because the dark theme is like, it's trending, people want it, and having even the slightest thing go wrong can reflect really badly on your app. A few apps that are definitely you should look at for inspiration. Twitter was doing it even before Android officially did dark theme, and they've done it fantastically. Almost everything is perfect, right from the illustrations to the colors to the background color. Pocket Casts is another great example. It's an app that I can't live without, and I've come to really appreciate the way they've done it. Sync for Reddit and Shutter Points are the other two examples. Perhaps not as popular as the first two. I don't know in Reddit's case, but perhaps not as popular as the first two, but they've also done really great jobs at implementing dark theme in material design. Please feel free to reach out to me either on Twitter or by email. Show me your app. I'd love to have a look and perhaps give it a shout out on Twitter. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience.